So it's important to identify what assets are marital versus what are non-marital. In a divorce, typically any assets that you acquire during the marriage, whether or not they're titled in your name, are still considered marital assets. Generally, the way the courts identify non-marital assets, they look at items or assets that were acquired before the marriage started, and they also look at gifts or inheritance during the marriage. And it's important to know this because anything that is considered not marital or separate property is not going to be divvied up by the courts as part of the marital estate. Sometimes when you have a very lengthy marriage, it can be difficult to prove whether or not an asset was separate property or whether or not it's a marital asset because of how long ago that asset was acquired. It's very important to have good record keeping to be able to show the ownership and the transfer of ownership and when that occurred, to be able to prove to a court whether or not an asset is in fact separate property. Oftentimes clients get confused and they believe that Colorado is a 50-50 state where things are split down the middle. Colorado is a court of equity, and that means that there's going to be an equitable division of the marital estate. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean 50-50, but it could. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the individual judge to determine what is an equitable split of the estate, and there are several different ways that your attorney can work with you to make the arguments necessary to get your fair share of the marital estate. Oftentimes, people make mistakes when trying to value assets in a marriage, especially when you talk about businesses, because oftentimes people simply look at what the numbers on the books read, but an actual valuation of a business can involve much more than that, and you really need to have an expert involved to come to an accurate valuation for what that business is worth. It's not uncommon that there's going to be a dispute about what the value of specific property is when you're in a divorce. Now, the courts ultimately are going to weigh whatever evidence is presented to them. So sometimes that may involve hiring an expert appraiser for the value of a home, having an expert business evaluator for the value of a business. Ultimately, it's about having the best evidence to present to the court when you go in front of the judge.